Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our 118th meetup today. I'm very pleased to be with Rudy today. And let's just start with the regular, our introduction. It will be around 4 and 5 minutes. And after that, Ruby will be talking about the new features in OpenJDK. As you know, Java Istanbul user group is most proactive and leading Java user group in Turkey. It's the biggest software engineering community in Turkey. We organize meetups, hackathons, and code retreat organizations regularly, and we organize our well-known Java Day Istanbul International Conference, which will be next year in 24-25 May. Currently, we have 6,000 members, and we have more than 100 events. We are constantly discussing how to grow Java ecosystem in Turkey, and we are actively participating to Java community process, shortly JCP, which is basically contributing to JDK. And this is progressing slowly, but we want more people to participate in this, and I highly encourage you to join our community. I believe one day JUG Istanbul will have a seat in the JCP executive community, and we are also contributing to Eclipse Foundation projects, and especially on Jakarta EE. If you want to be active in this process, please feel free to connect with us. And our upcoming events, you know, I told about code retreat events. In 13 November, we will have code retreat event. And in 25 November, we will have clean code series. This will be in Turkish. And if you don't heard about it yet, I strongly recommend our podcast, which you can both stream in Spotify and iTunes. And you can find very good topics and amazing speakers regularly in our podcast. And also we give away sometimes JetBrains licenses. So follow our meetups and our Twitter channel to get a chance to win. And of course, our sponsors, Definex and JFrog, Hazelcast, and GoToWebinar, and also JetBrains and Mural are our sponsors. Thanks to them for letting us more proactive in Java world, and I highly encourage you to join our Slack channel in order to share your experience and ask questions. And if you want to find out more, you can email us or send a message to our JUG Istanbul channel. And you can also scan this QR code from your mobile phone. And I will also send you the link that you can find more channels that you can reach us. And this is from us. And I will introduce you Rudy, and Rudy will explain us 7 reasons to switch to OpenJDK. Hi, Rudy. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think you are muted.
As usual. Thank you for the invitation. And wow, it's already the 108th meetup. That's quite a history of probably so many good presentations. So I hope I can tell you a bit today about JDK 17 and Jakarta EE.
Yeah, thank you. I will make you now presenter, and you can share your screen.
Yeah.
Yes. That's okay right now.
Yes. So,
and sorry for disturbing. And regarding questions, we will have the questions, and after the meetup and after the session, we will ask questions to Rudy. So please be patient regarding the questions, and you can ask your questions on the question section. And this is just a little disclaimer. Yeah, stage is on your Rudy.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so maybe first quick introduction for those who don't know JUG, because this presentation is also part of that JUG Tour that is organized by JUG themselves around JDK 17. So there's Fuji, also friends of OpenJDK. You can find there a lot of information on the website, also events. But it's basically a central place where the Java community can find information about the JVM, the Java, etc. There is daily, on every weekday, there is a blog or an article around something related to the JVM, so that can be very broad. All technologies, all aspects are covered on that one. We also provide content for that stream. But you also have a very detailed information. For instance, there was now, I think it was this week somewhere, I was even thinking yesterday, there was a small update of the JDK release. So there you can find every information about what was in that release. People can vote on it, and then there are summaries made so that you can see what people find the most interesting in a new release. So you have that for every single version, going back to Java 7. So it's not the entire history, but let's say the most recent one in Java 7 is already what 10 or 12 years old at least. So that's quite the history. And so you can see here then, for instance, for JDK 17, not sure if it's orders by voting, or I can ask for voting, and takes more time now. But yeah, as you can see, there is a lot of information based there. And it seems that my browser is hanging. There it is. This is the 17 one. Probably, I hope that I can select on the voting. Seems that my screen sharing and the website don't go together. And also a very nice thing, what you can use is, for instance, that the command line, and that you have a list of all the possible command lines that are available, and have a look at that number, 1798. So that means there is a lot to find here, the new ones, those that are removed, etc. So Fuji is the place where you can find all that information around performance, even books, tutorials. That's all JVM related information is combined here today. There is an advisory board that determines more or less the roadmap for what that website would look like, what features would be included in the future. See, there are some interesting companies, including we are as Payara. As I mentioned, we contribute to that one. So I invite you to take a look at that website if you want to have some more information out for some specific JVM feature, for instance. But let's concentrate now on JDK 17, and mainly what that means if you are an enterprise developer. The title is 7 reasons, but there are many more reasons. Even in the presentation, I highlight to potentially 13 reasons, because I have to see that I don't go over the hour, because I can talk a lot, I can talk much about this release. So maybe find the 7 reasons why you would switch to JDK 17 based on the information that you have today. So JDK 17, Jakarta EE, to get the timeline correct, Jakarta EE 9.1, which was the latest release, was out in May of this year, JDK 17 last month. So Jakarta EE didn't know about JDK 17. So can the JUG dream about a sailing trip with the boat of Jakarta EE? Is that even possible to run Jakarta EE applications with JDK 17? Well, Of course, yes. Otherwise, I would not give this presentation because then it would be a very short one because I could not show it to you. But as you will see, you can even use Jakarta EE8. So the version of 2 years old in combination with JDK 17. So that works perfectly. There are only a few minor things that you need to watch out for. But in general, you can use it with any runtime on JDK 17 if they are available. More on that in a minute. And for those who don't know me, so I'm Rudy De Busscher. I'm working for Payara as product manager, but also give presentations like this one. And I'm also involved in the MicroProfile specifications and a few of the Jakarta ones, mainly around security. And what is the idea of today is that I'll show you a few of the language changes which are introduced between JDK 11 and 17. And as I mentioned, there is you can use it already today. So I give a short demo of how you can use those switch expression text blocks and records, for example, with a Java with a Jakarta EE application. But I will go to some operational changes, some changes in using class data sharing, and if I have time, maybe a quick word on some security related changes. But as usual, security is up to the last minute in a project, although it should deserve more time, of course. You know it, JDK 17 is the latest LTS, the long-term supported version. So it will not be replaced in 6 months as with JDK 16 is, for instance, and with 18, the next version. Vendors will also support that LTS version for normally around 7 years. So it is a good candidate for if you want to switch from 11, for instance, now to 17, because you can stay on a long time on the same version. You probably need to update your JDK installation itself, but you are not confronted with some changes, some breaking changes or new language features, which can influence the stability of the JVM itself, of course, and your application. There are many changes between JDK 11 and 17, and not only Java language changes like that record structure, which is new, but also JVM changes, mainly around the garbage collection area. There is a lot work performed in the last 3 years around that, but also some operational aspects which makes it easier. Speaking at the time between 11 and 17 was 3 years, 6 releases of each 6 months. Now with the new cadence, they have decided that 3 years was a bit too long. So the following, the next LTS will be in 2 years, not in 3 years. So the next LTS will be JDK 21. Quick update on Jakarta EE, where are we? As Java EE was donated by Oracle to the Eclipse Foundation, and then that entire source code, it was about a few 100,000 lines of code, was imported in all the infrastructure of Eclipse Foundation. And for instance, the Maven artifact changed name, etc. And then the same code was released as Jakarta EE8, so still with that Java X namespace and certified for JDK 8. Because the idea was the only change was that it was a binary identical version of Java EE8, just that it was produced on the Eclipse Foundation infrastructure. Then due to legal reasons, every class within the Java X namespace was protected. You were not allowed to change it. It was some of the legal aspects of that donation. So that was the reason why we have then EE9 with the Jakarta namespace. Again, that was the only change because it was an important one. That namespace, it was a breaking change. For the first time in 20 years, there was something breaking in the Java enterprise world. And then few months later, in May of this year, there was Jakarta EE 9, which was then certified for JDK 11. Jakarta EE 10 is coming, as there are many changes ongoing these days. And you can expect a release of EE 10 in the beginning of next year, with many updates and new features within the different specs, of course. JDK 17 is out. Can you use the Payara products on JDK 17 already? We are still working on that, but you can already use it because I will show it you today. For instance, yesterday we released version 2021.8. We release monthly, and there the Payara micro binary is capable of running on JDK 8, 11, and 17. So that's one and the same binary that you can use on all those LTS versions. There are still a few missing elements. For instance, the database connection with Eclipse Link is not updated and not ready yet for JDK 17, but that we hopefully address by next month, and then together with all the OSGI changes that we need to do for Payara server. And then we have hopefully next month a fully supported platform on JDK 17. So the switch from JDK 8 to 11 was a difficult one. It was one with many challenges. That's also the reason why probably about 50% of the world is still running on JDK 8 or even older versions. So is the switch from JDK 11 to 17 then easier? Yes, much easier. There are a few changes, language features, as I said, garbage collector changes, but all of those do not impact for a great deal the capability of running your program on JDK 17. There are only a few changes that you need to do, and then your application, which was perfectly running on JDK 11, then you can run it on 17. I'll come to that later, what you need to change. So we believe that a lot of people who are already running on 11 will switch to JDK 17 in, let's say, the coming 6 months or so. So what is new and, in my opinion, important for a enterprise developer as a language feature? First of all, we have those switch expressions now and no longer statements, but that switch keyword returns a value now. We have some nice changes on streams. We have those text blocks, of course, that you probably heard already. Records, also one of the most discussed topics in the Java world the last few years. We have pattern matching, and then a few others, which I don't have enough time to go over all of them. And we have the sealed classes. The next one is something that you need to watch out for, because some of the JDK internals are now again encapsulated. So there are still things that are open, but others are closed now. So if you have the error message that a certain class or package is not enabled for access by the unnamed module, then you know that you need to add opens option for the moment, or of course, ideally you need to change your application, or we need to change our code and the libraries, of course. But as mentioned, there is more than just language changes. There are operational changes. There are a lot of changes and a lot of improvements. I will give you some examples, for instance, around performance and garbage collection, which has greatly improved. And I don't use them in my demo today at the new type of garbage collectors, at the Z garbage collector and the Shenandoah, which are aimed at having a very low overhead on the application itself. So they are hardly interacting, so there is no stop the world anymore, or only for a few milliseconds, so very brief period, so that they can do some marking and collecting on some critical areas, but all the rest is done in parallel, which means that those set garbage collector and Shenandoah are very useful in various scenarios for your application, especially when you are having high throughput. There is also a change in CDS, the class data sharing, which I showed briefly. The flight recorder now, for those who know it, it's no longer only for diagnostics, but you can use it for monitoring, which is also a good thing. There is now support for that new core, that new CPU core architecture, the ARC-64. And we have, again, a packaging tool that was, the previous one was included in Java FX, but that was removed from the JDK, I think it was JDK 9. So that means that you can now again create a installable distribution, for instance, for your client code that can be installed by the user easily with an installer and etc. So that makes it easier. So let's go quickly over those most important changes and some best practices around it. First of all, you have that switch expression now, so it returns value, and you can define the value that needs to be returned by putting it just after the arrow, and then that value, for instance, the red value for North and South America is returned in that variable color. You can still use the old style and that you use the colon, and that you say case Asia colon, and then you perform some statements. You can still use them break so that you don't have fall through to the different cases, but you need to return a value. And there is a bit confusion possible, so watch out what you are using. Don't use, for instance, with the break, because with break you can now also return a value from within the switch statement. But not in this case, because if you use break blue or yellow, then that blue or yellow will be considered as a label, and the compiler will search for a label in your code, which it does not find, and the compiler says that your program is not valid. In that case, you should use yield instead of break. Break can be used to return a numeric value, for instance. So if you say, return me the number of days in a month, yeah, I know that there is a JDK method for that, but you can say break 31, for instance, because 31 can never be a label. So then the compiler knows that you want to return the value. But as I said, that is very confusing because you mix things. And yield, you will need it anyway, because you can have, of course, a block, not just return a constant value. You can return, you can first perform some statements, execute some methods, and then return a value. You cannot use return there as a keyword, because then you return from the method, and that is not possible. So that's something that the compiler forbids you to do. So you should use the yield keyword to return from a case like I have shown it in the example. Every time I say yield, I need to think about the thread yield method, but yeah, of course, this is something different. For streams, there are a few changes and nice changes. This is maybe a specific one that some of the people are having encountered a scenario like this before. For instance, you have a stream where you do a filtering, mapping, whatever you need, but at the end you need to pass the results of those stream elements to two collectors. That was not possible, so you had to duplicate it, you had to execute it twice, so that was not a nice thing. So now you have the teeing method, where you can specify two collectors and a function which assembles the result of those two collectors in a return value of that teeing method. So now you only need to write it once, it's only performed once, but each element is then handed over to those both collectors. The function can create a custom an instance of one of your custom classes, so that you have a return type which clearly indicates what was the result of collector 1 and collector 2. But I also see some people who just using a hash map for that. So they just return a hash map where the key is then identification of what collector the result is. But that's of course less type safe than using a specific class for that. The map multi is something what much more people will use, because now you can do some kind of combination between a filtering, a mapping, and even create multiple elements in your stream. So it's no longer required that each element of your stream is mapped to one element. You had the there was one method, name escaped me now, that you can the flat map. Indeed, you can to collapse several collections, for instance. But now you have the possibility to perform a certain action on a stream element, and that can be, and that's very flexible. For instance, as the example shows there, you have that map multi where you have two values, two values that you pass to that method. The first one is the number. For instance, that's your stream element yourself. So suppose you have a stream of numbers. And then you get also a downstream, I call it downstream, that's a collector. So downstream is what you pass on to the next stage of your stream. And you can then write, for instance, for a for list where, based on the number that you seeing in the stream, that you create multiple elements downstream. So for instance, if that map multi receives the number 7 as a stream element, then the downstream, every method which comes after that, this map multi will see 7 elements, 0, 1, 3, etc. until 6. So now you have really total control of what you're doing in stream. So this is a method which has so many possible scenarios, so many use cases that probably a lot of people will find a good use for it. Then there is that shorthand. Instead of .collector, collectors to list, you have now to list. It's handy, it is shorthand, but watch out for it, because there is a potential issue if you change your code and replace every collectors to list with the to list. But more on that in the example. Text blocks, multi-line strings, very easy to create within your source code now, because it does not need to be on one line anymore. You don't need to concatenate and use the new line indicator, etc. Just the text between the source code, the text between the triple quotes that will be your no string. And there is one thing that you need to watch out for, which is called incidental and intentional white space. The placement of that last triple quote is important, because that's, as the line shows, defines what white space is included in your string and which white space is not part of your string at the runtime. So everything on the left of that line is excluded, and on the right of the line is included. So the the two spaces before that Olympic color there, that is included in your string, but not the 5 other spaces in front of that line. At the end of the line, everything is trimmed unless you put somewhere a \s, and then that's the way how you can keep some spaces at the end of the line without your compiler trimming it away. Records, and one of the useful things. And records are a new type of class, just as enum was a type. You also now have records. So you define it as public record, and then a name, of course. And you define the properties, variables, what your record will hold. Constructor is generated automatically, where you can pass on those two values within the constructor. You have getter methods and you have setter methods also by default. So it reduces a lot of boilerplate codes, especially for those DTOs, data transfer objects. Records itself are final, so you cannot extend them. You cannot extend one record from another record, for instance. And also the properties itself, so in this case, the get name and the get continent are also final. So that means they need to have a value, they need to receive a value within the constructor. One important thing that you need to watch out for if you are using records in combination with Jakarta EE for the moment is that those records do not follow the Java Bean specification. So that means setters and getters are not created with a get name and set name. So if I would create a country DTO where I just have defined string name and string continent name, then the getter would be named name, just as the property. But the JSONB specification, which is, for instance, used if you return an object from a method which is linked to a JAX-RS endpoint, and it needs to be converted to JSON, explicitly state that only getters should be considered for the output. So if you just define that country DTO with string name and string continent name, then your result would be empty because there is no get name found. So the workaround for the moment, because probably in Jakarta EE10 already, the JSONB specification will be adapted that for a record, every value will be considered. The workaround is, of course, that you name your properties get name, because then the method to retrieve the value is also called get name and is according to the JSONB specification. There are a few constructors possible with records. There is a new type of constructor now, which is called compact constructor. Although you don't see any parameters, you don't type those brackets, you just type the name, in this case public country DTO, but that means that by default that constructor also takes two values, get name and get continent in our case. As mentioned, the properties are final, so that means that you need to assign them also in your compact constructor. So you need to have those two lines where you assign get name to the this.getName and the other one. This is the default constructor, which is always available. That's the canonical constructor called, and you can use it to make it explicitly that you need to pass those two values, and those kind of constructors are then used typically for doing some additional checks, which are defining some constraints on your DTO, for instance. The pattern matching. Sorry for that. You probably have a lot of cases in your code, like if an object is instance of a certain class, then if that's the case, then cast that object to that class. The typical are those equals code, to those equals methods where you check if it's the same or not, and if it's an instance of country or not in this case. But now you can, during the check of the instance of, you can also assign a variable. So in this case, if the instance of checked of country is valid, then the country variable will receive a pointer, because Java uses pointers for that, a pointer to that object O. In this case, the if is inverted. If not O instance, that means within the if block, you cannot use country, but you can use it after it, just as I did with that equals check. And that's the typical flow scoping that we know already within Java. And so when you define a variable in the middle of a method, that variable is known from that point on to the end, but not before. So country is only, as variable is only known after the instance of was successful. There is also a pattern matching for switch, which is probably less useful because doing a switch on different types of objects is occurring less than that instance of check that we do. But again, if the variable O is a string, then you can use the S variable after it was successful. So I can use it in my system out print line, which is included there. And I mentioned already pointers. Again, the joke that a language that doesn't have pointers, but the most common exception is null pointer exception. But now we have some helpful message in that null pointer exception, because before, if you had, for instance, that a.b.c.d, and you assign it a value and you received a null pointer exception, it was just something is NULL, but is that a.b, a.b.c? You did not know. Now in the message you get explicitly what statement was NULL. For instance, you get a message a.b resulted in NULL, and that's the reason for this null pointer exception. So then you can search very easy or much easier to define why B was NULL, although you don't expect it, because clearly you wrote that statement where you expected all variables can be referenced. So let's have a look at the demo. I have created here a Jakarta EE8 application. I have specified that the compiler needs to use JDK 17. Source code is also JDK 17. And the only thing that I need to make as a change, and if you need JDK 17 compilation, that's also a thing that you need to watch out for, is that the Maven WAR plugin must be at minimum 3.3.1. That's because of those JDK internals, which are shielded off now more. And if you are using an older version of this on JDK 16 already and 17, then you get an error that certain classes and packages are not accessible. But other than that, you can create your WAR file for JDK 17. I have here an endpoint, a typical endpoint, where I return a DTO, where I have here a service which returns that DTO. But as you expected on the name, that is that record where I have specified that get name, and that workaround for the moment for getting it work in JDK 17. And then here, then this is not, this should be reading from the database, but now it's just a hard-coded list, as I mentioned. And you can create those DTOs and now easily also within that map here, for instance, in that stream here, because you have there the constructor, the default constructor of DTO taking those two values. And then I mentioned that you need to watch out for toList instead of the collectors as a shorthand. This toList as a shorthand for the long one, because toList returns an unmodifiable list. this collectors to list returns a array list, which means that the result of this method was a list which you could change. You could remove and add items to that list. If you are using toList and you try to do it, then of course you get an exception that you have an unmodifiable list. So my advice is that you don't blindly change every collectors to list to this shorthand, because probably you will run into some exceptions when you're running your application. So I have Java 17 here active. So let's double check if it's correct. So yes, that's the one of September, so last month. And I can do a Maven clean package. And my WAR file is created and can be used on Payara Micro, for instance. There is my WAR file. I have here also Java 17. So that means I can say Java -run Payara Micro. I don't need clustering, so that's faster startup. And this is my WAR file that I created. So I started up, and as you will see, that starts perfectly, no issues with that. And I get the confirmation that I have those endpoints. So let's try it out with the curl command. And that's the list of all the countries in Europe. That this demo was made because there was the Olympic Games this year. So with a bit of countries and I'm playing with the color, you see, I get a list back of JSON where I have those content name and names. And I have values, and all the countries are here. So my record here that I created, my list of country data, which is a record, is functioning perfectly, even only having a dependency on Java EE8 or Jakarta EE8 in this case. Let's give an example of those text blocks. You see also my IDE helps me here about that incidental and intentional. I always need to think about the exact names. So these 4 characters, those 4 spaces are within the result or within the string. Since it is just a string, then I can use later on here the format value, the string format on that one. And here, so I'm giving an example of those switch expressions where you can return a value, and that returns then the information that I wanted as so with these text blocks. So let's try that out. I want to know the Olympic color of country 56. 56, which happens to be Belgium, and which is green because it's in Europe, and you see those 4 spaces here at the beginning that I have defined here also in the program code. There is also making use of here with that country, with that instance of, and that that pattern matching. So I used all those new features of JDK 17 in this application, which is running fine today. So you can already use that. So next thing I want to highlight, which is also important in discussion these days, is fast startup. And in my belief, you have 2 options. You either rewrite your application in using a framework, a product that supports native compilation, which is not ideal if you ask me, if you need to rewrite it. You can consider it if you are creating a application from scratch, but an existing application rewriting just to have a little bit faster startup and a little bit less memory is not a good choice, if you ask me. But this class data sharing, I have some presentations about it, what it exactly does in detail. But the idea is that because the class loading your class through the class loader and do all the verification steps there at that point makes that your Java application starts up slower than you like to have it in your environment. This class data sharing, and it was already available in JDK 11, you can prepare your entire class information in a format that is immediately usable by the JVM in a memory mapped read-only file. So that file is mapped into the JVM process space, so it's not loaded into memory, it is used directly from disk. And since it contains all the information, that goes, of course, extremely fast because there is no class loading done anymore. So you can achieve like 35% startup improvements without changing one line of code in your application. And a change here now between JDK 11 and 17 is that you can create that archive file much easier. With JDK 11, the first step was that you needed to create a file containing every class that you want to have in that archive file, which is creating manually is an impossible task. So you have that parameter dump loaded class list. And then the second step was that you need to create that archive file, and here the XX shared archive file in a second step, which was rather slow, and then you could use that file. OpenJ9, which is another JVM implementation, they had already within JDK 11 the option to create that archive file at the end of the application. So if your JVM exits at that moment, the content of the memory is dumped to file all the information related to classes, which makes sense, of course, because if it's in the JVM process memory already, it was verified, it was active, it was a good class file, etc. So having that file created from there was a clever idea, and that is now taken as an option also in JDK 17 in the OpenJDK version. And you have now the option there, archive classes at exit, and you have that file immediately available. So let's have a look to see what performance improvements you can achieve. So let's first have a benchmark. So how fast does my application start up without doing anything? So the classic JVM. So I start Payara Micro, and the deployment directory points to a directory that contains my application, and I can say that there is no clustering. And the application starts up in 5.4 seconds, which is faster than on JDK 11. More on that in a minute. The next step is what we need to do is create that archive file. So that here, that archive classes at exit. We also need to have a specific launcher for Payara, because by default, what that Payara, that Java manager Payara Micro did was unzipping itself mainly, and then adding a lot of jar files dynamically to the class loader. And you can imagine all that dynamic hocus pocus is not a good friend of that CDS, because it changes your class path. So this launcher, which we have already available since a long time, can create a jar file where the class path is fixed with all the files. And we have also that warm up parameter here. And that parameter indicates that when Payara Micro is started and ready to receive requests, that it shuts down, because that warm up was specifically created for CDS here, and also in JDK 11 already. So you see that now you get those messages that not all classes are supported, not everything is in that archive file, some files because they are not linked, some classes because they are not linked, some because the compilation was pre-JDK 6, so that's way too old. But at the end, you have here a completely read-only file for everyone, so no one can tamper with it, not even root, unless you change the permissions, of course, which you should not do then, of course. And that archive file here now contains the entire class loading of your application in combination with Payara Micro. The system one, for the JDK itself, that is already available in the JDK installation, so that's a different archive file. So we had 5.4 seconds, if I remember correctly. So let's see if we are using that archive file now, what kind of performance improvement we can achieve. If I do it correctly, and is this one. So just need to specify that file, the jar file, because not all classes are in there. There is about 99% of the classes, but I don't need to specify anymore any parameters nor the application, because the entire application is already in that archive file. It was 5.4, now it's only 4 seconds. So again, we have an improvement of around 30%, if my quick math is correct. And as you see, without any change into the application, it is the same binary, the same application, the same WAR file. I don't have time anymore, I see, for another nice, cool feature. First, those garbage collectors. About that performance, as I mentioned, there are two new collectors, those that garbage collector and that Shane and Doa, but also G1 is improved, and the JVM in general has received some improvements. Because I did some tests with that same Payara micro binary, so that it is this exact the same version, this exact the same application, and I only assign it 256 megabyte with an application which has an endpoint which uses a massive amount of CPU and memory to calculate some prime values. If I run that same application, that same endpoint on JDK 11, then I see that I get a value of around 115. If I run it on JDK 17, I get a value of around 90. And you see about those box plots, there is really a significant difference. So even without any change, your application will run about 20% faster on JDK 17 than on JDK 11. Of course, it depends on what you're doing, and probably because I'm forcing here now a lot of garbage collectors events that will affect that, of course, that improvement, but in general, your application will run significantly faster. Flight recorder, as I mentioned, it's no longer only for profiling, and so that you have a dump file and that you can watch all the events happening and see if you can make anything out of those events to see what happened and your system dies, for instance. You can now also have it for monitoring with the event streaming. Sadly enough, I don't have enough time to show it to you, but otherwise you could see that I could receive all those garbage collection events in real time in another process, or of course, much more useful in a production situation is that you write some Java agents where you stream all those events to an external system so that you can monitor your application in real time without the need of any external library or product. As I mentioned, security for the last minute, probably not that dramatic unless you are using sockets yourself and you define that they are still using TLS 1.0 or 1.1. because those are disabled now. It was also the case on JDK 11 already on a certain update, because they are indicated as not secure enough anymore. The same for those weak curves, which are disabled for elliptical calculations there. They are disabled, so that means there is still a parameter in the JDK, a configuration file where you can enable them again, but of course, that's not the ideal that you enable something which is determined as not suited anymore. There are new cipher suites, there is new support for the hashing algorithms, but the most important for me is that the last one there is that you have context-specific deserialization filters. And you know that you can serialize the Java instances to a stream, so to a file, and read them back, or you can serialize them between systems. But of course, that is a major security risk, because someone can inject there some serialized content which can do some harmful content. With these serialization filters, you can define on the JVM level now what classes you expect in the serialized format. If there is anything else in that, something that does not belong there, then that means that the deserialization will fail. So that's a very important security measure that you could take to protect your environment if you are using serialization, of course. So my 7 reasons. Records, of course, that's one of the nice things that Java enterprise users will use for those DDOs. The pattern matching, the instance of. Don't forget the performance and the garbage collection improvements. That's also a major point for switching to JDK 17. Those switch expressions, class data sharing, text block, and that's those security things. So that's my top 7 out of the 13. If you made a count of it, you come to 13 different improvements that I showed here. So this is my top 7. So thank you for your attention. If you are interested in knowing more about Payara, you can get to the Get Started page on our website, or you can download Payara Micro and Payara Server for those who did not play it already with Payara. So are there any questions?
Yeah, well, thank you, Rudy. Actually, there is one question which you can see also in the chat. Can we use those parameters on Java 11? I couldn't recall which parameters, but let's answer the other questions and we can have an update maybe. Java XX parameters. Can we use Java XX parameters on Java?
It was in the beginning of the presentation, I see. So what did I tell about parameters in the beginning? Sorry for searching here. Well, actually, you know, you can have a look at that Fuji website. If it's parameters, for instance, for the JDK itself for startup, then you can find them there and see if they are available on 11 or not. If it's other parameters, then of course of code, then yeah, then I need to know more. What was the context of that question? I see also the question about sharing the code examples in the presentation. Yes, those will be available. I can either send them to here to the JUG itself, or I can put them on Twitter if you like, so that you can pick them up there tomorrow.
Yeah, both suits us actually. And I think regarding the parameters, Altu is mentioning fast startup.
Yes, so there are indeed, you can use them on JDK 11. So this is the version that you need to use on JDK 11. On the OpenJDK variants, because as I said, on OpenJ9, you can they are slightly different. And if you want to use it on JDK 17, then you need to have a slightly modified version. But if you're interested in that, in running it on JDK 11, they are available on the internet. So I have presentation where I go into detail what they all mean and how you can use them. So I propose that you have a look at those presentations then.
And there is also one question. I will also write in the chat to you. Is JDK 17 backwards compatible with JDK 11?
From the Java language constructs, yes. So there are a few methods which are removed, few classes which are removed, but they are very minimal. So in theory, you could have the chance that you are using one of them. What you most likely will hit is that you have that here, that those JDK internals which are encapsulated now better. For those who were very attentive, you can see here also a warning that we still need to fix related to security. That you see that a certain illegal access error, because that package sun security util was not exported to a named module. Likely you will encounter some exceptions like this one, and then you need to add the open, just as you had to do with JDK 11. That's the quick solution. Long and the good solution is, of course, what we are doing now is that we are removing usages of that package within our code base, of course. But to answer the question, JDK 17 is not 100% backwards compatible, but is like 99.5% backwards compatible. So there are only a few corner cases where you need to change something.
Okay, I think we have all the questions right now, and we are running our time. So in the introduction, we will have the code retreat organization in 13 November. So you can find details in our channels. And also I write in the chat for the attendees right now, you can send email if you want a JetBrains license, and we will organize it. That's from us. Thank you again, Rudy. You can have your words. Yeah.
And thank you for the opportunity to speak at the JUG here.
Yeah. And also thanks for Fujay community. They also helped us to reach you and organize this meetup. And for our audience, please follow Fujay. They have very good contents in their website. And as Rudy introduced ourselves, yeah, that's okay for today. And have a nice evening. Thank you again, Rudy. Bye bye.
Yeah. Enjoy your evening.
Yeah, thank you.